So far we have discussed three systems. We have discussed the phosphagen system, which is the system that can resynthesize ATP the fastest. You saw that it was involved in that sprint when ATP demand was at its highest, and that's because, again, this system can resynthesize ATP the fastest. But it's also very short-lived. And there are other instances where it's used too that we'll discuss relatively shortly. Second, there is what's known as anaerobic or anaerobic or fast glycolysis. In our example of the sprint, this and the phosphagen system both picked up pretty quick due to ADP accumulating, as well as calcium and epinephrine in the bloodstream. Calcium in the muscle cell, epinephrine in the blood. ADP triggering phosphofructokinase, enzyme of glycolysis, to increase its activity, as well as phosphocreatine in the phosphagen system, and then the calcium and epinephrine triggering more glycogen to be broken down to glucose by activating phosphorylase. Anaerobic or fast glycolysis we know as our second fastest system for resynthesizing ATP, but it only produces 2 ATP per glucose molecule. So not much ATP per glucose, but it can produce it very quickly, most likely because of the fact that it's independent of oxygen. It doesn't matter the rate at which oxidative phosphorylation is operating inside of the mitochondria, because pyruvate is turned into lactate to regenerate NAD to keep glycolysis running at a rapid rate to keep producing ATP. These two systems work together in our sprint to try and meet the demand of ATP. Most likely the phosphagen system can accomplish that, but anaerobic or fast glycolysis cannot, which is why after we see the phosphagen system depleted, is probably when we start to see muscle fatigue start to set in, especially in this particular type of muscle cell called fast twitch muscle fibers. So we see the velocity of the sprint fall off. Theoretically, if that sprint were to continue on, we'd see a greater and greater decline in velocity due to the continued fatigue within the muscle cells. The third system that we discussed was aerobic glycolysis or slow glycolysis. I want to point out again that this system would be active during our sprint. It's not like it's not. All three of these systems would be operating together, but it would be the least important, or the one that supplies the least amount of ATP to the muscle cell during a sprint. This pathway produces about 32 ATP per glucose molecule, which is a lot, but as we have discussed, it's really entirely dependent upon oxygen. So it produces the most amount of ATP per glucose molecule, but as we're going to discuss in a moment here in more detail, this system is really reliant upon oxygen being available inside of the mitochondria. So that is most likely a limiting factor. Okay. So now what I want to do is discuss in more detail the importance of oxygen. You know this to some degree already, but the importance of oxygen in the mitochondria to the electron transport chain, how that's a limiting factor, and then get back to this discussion of somebody, running at a moderate pace on a treadmill. You know that during kind of a moderate ATP demand instance, like 6-7 miles an hour on a treadmill, that the majority of pyruvate produced in glycolysis is being shuttled into the mitochondria and used in this aerobic or slow glycolysis to produce about 32 ATP per glucose molecule. But now I want to get into more detail as to why that's the case. Why can all of that pyruvate be shuttled into the mitochondria and not turned into lactate? And then in what instances would we see a transition, maybe from aerobic or slow glycolysis to more anaerobic or fast glycolysis? So let's focus on the importance of oxygen in the electron transport chain, and then get back to the discussion of that moderate intensity jog, moderate ATP demand instance, and how these transitions would occur between systems. So I realized I said I was going to talk about the jog later on, but I'm going to relate the importance of oxygen in the electron transport chain to the jog. So let's just go ahead and address that. You get on a treadmill, you start running at maybe, I don't know, 6 miles per hour, and inside of your muscle fibers, this is going to vary from one fiber type to the next to a degree, as we'll discuss later on in the class. But a generic muscle fiber, the ATP demand is going to rise substantially, right? And what's going to start to accumulate inside of the muscle fiber is ADP. The accumulation of ADP, believe it or not, is actually going to stimulate the phosphagen system, right? ADP is going to activate creatine kinase, which is going to be involved in activating, or it's going to be involved in pushing forward the reaction of phosphocreatine, donating its phosphate to ADP to resynthesize ATP. So the phosphagen system is actually going to be activated at the beginning of this moderate intensity jog, as will glycolysis. And that should seem obvious, but ADP is going to stimulate phosphofructokinase, which is involved in glycolysis, the rate-limiting enzyme of glycolysis. So the rate of glycolysis will pick up. Also, calcium will start accumulating inside of the muscle fiber, which will start triggering the breakdown of glycogen to glucose, which is going to be needed. It's going to help make glucose available, glucose 6-phosphate, for glycolysis, which we're running faster. Now, interestingly, at the beginning of this jog, you're going to be running specifically anaerobic or fast glycolysis. Right? We're going to start making a little bit of lactate by converting pyruvate into lactate to regenerate NAD to keep glycolysis going. You're going to actually run the phosphagen system and anaerobic or fast glycolysis to a pretty good degree at the beginning of even this moderate ATP demand instance. It's not going to be anything close to the rate that you would during a sprint, but these two systems are going to play an important role within like the first minute of you being on that treadmill. And exactly why that's the case, we will discuss later on in the semester. Most likely there are two possibilities. Maybe we're waiting for oxygen to become available to the muscle fibers to get oxidative phosphorylation running fast enough. Or maybe we're waiting for a greater accumulation of ADP to get the rest of the systems running fast enough. It's kind of a debated area, but these two sort of anaerobic fast systems, even during a moderate intensity instance in your muscle fibers, gets used at the beginning. It doesn't last very long, the rate at which they're, the increased rate that they're used, but they do play a very important role, even at the beginning of moderate intensity, moderate ATP demand instances in your muscle fibers. Very quickly, though, within a minute or so, the rate at which they're being used will drop off pretty fast. And the pyruvate that's being created from glycolysis will start getting pushed into the mitochondria at a greater rate. Some of it's always being moved into the mitochondria, but after a minute or so, most, if not all, most of, for sure, of the pyruvate that's being created from glycolysis will now start moving into the mitochondria, and we want to think about why that's the case. But there's a little bit more also to say about this diagram. What you'll notice about the diagram is ADP, when it accumulates at the beginning of the jog, it's not just involved with stimulating the phosphagen system to a degree. It's not just involved with stimulating glycolysis to run at a faster rate by activating the rate-limiting enzyme, but it's also involved with stimulating the rate-limiting enzyme of the citric acid cycle, as well as cytochrome oxidase, which is the fourth complex of the electron transport chain. So as that ADP accumulates a little bit at the beginning of the jog, as more ATP is being consumed, it's activating and stimulating all of these systems to get going. It's stimulating the citric acid cycle to increase its rate, as well as the electron transport chain. Again, anaerobic or fast glycolysis is kind of going to help us out for the first minute or so, along with the phosphagen system, but after that period of time, the majority of the pyruvate being created from glycolysis is going to get shuttled into the mitochondria to be fed into the citric acid cycle, and the NADH and FADH from the citric acid cycle is going to be fed into the electron transport chain. So let's look at that more. So we know that glycolysis is running faster during this moderate ATP demand instance. ADP is stimulating phosphofructokinase, the rate-limiting enzyme. Glycogen is being broken down into glucose 6-phosphate at a greater rate thanks to calcium epinephrine, so we're running this faster, producing more pyruvate and NADH. And like I said, after about a minute or so, the majority of this NADH and pyruvate that's being created in this moderate intensity instance is going to get shuttled into the mitochondria, as will NADH through that shuttle mechanism we discussed. So here we go. Like I said, after a short period of time, the majority of that pyruvate is entering into the mitochondria, being converted into acetyl-CoA and being run through the Krebs cycle, which is being stimulated to run faster by ADP, stimulating isocitrate dehydrogenase, which is the rate-limiting enzyme of this cycle. So now what are we doing? We're producing a whole bunch of NADH as well as FADH, complex 2 of the electron transport chain, if you remember, is what actually is making FADH because it's succinate dehydrogenase. That is complex 2, that enzyme. So by moving that pyruvate into the mitochondria and running it through the citric acid cycle, we're making a whole bunch more NADH as well as FADH. And right, we're running glycolysis at a faster rate thanks to that accumulation of ADP triggering phosphofructokinase and causing glycolysis to run faster, more glycogen being broken down to glucose thanks to calcium and epinephrine. So we're making more pyruvate, and we're also running the citric acid cycle faster, also thanks to ADP. So what you should be getting in your head here is we're starting to produce a lot of NADH and FADH thanks to the accelerated rate of glycolysis and the citric acid cycle. And now you want to remember we're also getting the electron transport chain to pick up its pace, which is going to be good because we're going to need to do that because of the fact that we've got all this NADH and FADH. So ADP, an increase, will help stimulate cytochrome oxidase, also known as complex 4. So what we know is we're producing more NADH as well as FADH, thanks to more glycolysis, thanks to more of the citric acid cycle, which is being fed into the electron transport chain, which is also running faster, just like glycolysis and the citric acid cycle, thanks to ADP. So what that should tell you is we've got more electrons being shuttled through the electron transport chain, which is pumping more hydrogen ions into the inner membrane space, which is creating a greater gradient. So now more hydrogen ions are coming back through ATP synthase, and we're increasing the rate of ATP synthase, phosphorylating ADP back to ATP. So what's happening? We're increasing the rate of ATP production via oxidative phosphorylation. But there's an important point to be made here. This system isn't going to be able to increase the rate of oxidative phosphorylation unless there's enough oxygen. So that's certainly not last in line, but that's the last thing to discuss. It's an incredibly important, maybe the most important factor for ensuring that this system can actually keep running at a fast enough rate to produce all of this ATP and meet the ATP demand of the muscle cell. So it's great that we've got glycolysis running faster, we've got the citric acid cycle running faster, we've got the electron transport chain running faster. None of that really matters as far as aerobic or slow ATP production goes unless there's enough oxygen coming to the fourth complex. Let's talk about why. So ADP, an increase, will help stimulate cytochrome oxidase, also known as complex 4. So what we know is we're producing more NADH as well as FADH, thanks to more glycolysis, thanks to more of the citric acid cycle, which is being fed into the electron transport chain, which is also running faster, just like glycolysis and the citric acid cycle, thanks to ADP. So what that should tell you is we've got more electrons being shuttled through the electron transport chain, which is pumping, more hydrogen ions into the inner membrane space, which is creating a greater gradient. So now more hydrogen ions are coming back through ATP synthase, and we're increasing the rate of ATP synthase, phosphorylating ADP back to ATP. So what's happening? We're increasing the rate of ATP production via oxidative phosphorylation. But there's an important point to be made here. This system isn't going to be able to increase the rate of oxidative phosphorylation unless there's enough oxygen. So that's certainly not last in line, but that's the last thing to discuss. It's an incredibly important, maybe the most important factor for ensuring that this system can actually keep running at a fast enough rate to produce all of this ATP and meet the ATP demand of the muscle cell. So it's great that we've got glycolysis running faster, we've got the citric acid cycle running faster, we've got the electron transport chain running faster. None of that really matters as far as aerobic or slow ATP production goes unless there's enough oxygen coming to the fourth complex. Let's talk about why. So we can bring as much NADH and FADH as we want to the electron transport chain and run it through the electron transport chain as much as we want. But without oxygen coming by and picking up the electrons from the fourth complex or oxidizing the fourth complex, it doesn't matter, right? Because if you bring all of this NADH and FADH to the electron transport chain without enough oxygen, these electrons will travel through the complexes and eventually will just get clogged up in here, right? Because you have to keep removing the electrons from the fourth complex in order to keep this system going. Otherwise, I mean, think about it. The electrons will all accumulate on the fourth complex, and then they'll accumulate through the electron transport chain, just like a sort of a traffic jam. And if electrons aren't being moved to the electron transport chain anymore, you won't have hydrogen ions being pumped into the inner membrane space, and you won't have a gradient anymore, and you won't then be driving ATP synthase to produce ATP anymore. So you need a sufficient amount of oxygen to be coming to the fourth complex in order for all of these systems running faster to mean anything with aerobic metabolism. That's why it's called aerobic metabolism, because it's dependent upon oxygen's availability. What I can tell you is that during this moderate intensity instance, where ATP demand is mostly moderate, Maybe it takes a minute or so, maybe it doesn't. Again, it's the debated area, but enough oxygen will come to the electron transport chain to run this system fast enough so that enough ATP can be made from oxidative phosphorylation. Enough ATP can be made from oxidative phosphorylation to meet the ATP demand of the muscle cell. In moderate ATP demand instances, that is almost certainly not a problem. For most muscle cells, there might be exceptions to that rule, but for most muscle cells, as long as the demand for ATP is low to moderate, enough oxygen can come to those muscle cells to keep removing electrons from the fourth complex, to keep this system running fast enough so that there can be a enough gradient to keep ATP synthase rotating at a rate where ATP can be made fast enough to meet the demand. Like I said previously, it takes about a minute or so to really get this oxidative phosphorylation process running, which is, as we'll discuss, but why the phosphagen system and anaerobic or fast glycolysis gets used at a greater rate for the first minute or so. But after that minute or so, there's enough oxygen coming to the muscle cell to now run this oxidative phosphorylation process to produce ATP fast enough to meet ATP demand. What actually causes that 1 minute delay is pretty contentious, which is why I'm stumbling around a little bit in talking about it, because you really need some context. You're going to need some context, you need some more information about the things that we're going to discuss to really be able to understand the different theories about why there's that sort of minute delay there. Anyways, as long as the ATP demand stays pretty moderate, the muscle cell can keep bringing enough oxygen to its mitochondria to remove the electrons from complex 4 to keep oxidative phosphorylation going fast enough to make enough ATP to meet the demand of the muscle cell. That's why in more moderate ATP demand instances, we commonly refer to it as aerobic exercise, because the muscle fibers are meeting the demand of ATP from the muscle cell through oxidative phosphorylation, which is an aerobic process. But now we want to talk about what would happen to drive the appearance of anaerobic or fast glycolysis, because up to this point the muscle cell would be using that to a degree. It's not like any of these systems are just used exclusively by themselves, but in this instance where ATP demand is more moderate, the cell is going to almost entirely rely on oxidative phosphorylation to produce the ATP to meet the demand of the muscle cell. That doesn't mean some of it's not going to be coming from the phosphagen system, some of it's not going to be coming from fast or anaerobic glycolysis, but the majority of it is going to be coming from this aerobic or slow glycolysis, because there's plenty of oxygen present to break those glucose molecules down through aerobic or slow glycolysis to meet ATP demand. So what do we have to do now what are the requirements for this transitioning to fast or anaerobic glycolysis? What we're going to have to do is we're going to have to increase the intensity of the exercise. Right? If we're running at a moderate intensity, let's say that's 6 miles per hour, maybe we go up to 9 miles per hour. The muscle fibers are going to have to, the muscle fibers that are involved at least, are going to have to contract more frequently in order to be able to run at 9 miles per hour, perhaps more forcefully as well. But that's a whole nother discussion. Regardless, ATP demand in the fibers is going to increase, right? You go from 6 miles an hour to 9 miles per hour, the ATP demand of the muscle fiber increases. If the ATP demand rises inside of the muscle fiber, what's going to happen? ADP is going to accumulate. If the muscle fiber is contracting more frequently, more calcium is going to accumulate. During higher intensity exercise, epinephrine rises in the bloodstream. So inside of the muscle fiber, you're going to have more ADP, you're going to have more calcium, and there's going to be more epinephrine in the bloodstream. And now we want to think about, well, what does all of this translate into? This is what's happening when we increase the intensity of exercise and the ATP demand rises in the muscle fibers. Well, ADP is going to trigger all these systems to run faster. Yes, you're going to get some more activation of the phosphagen system, minor. The main things that you're going to get is you're going to get greater stimulation of phosphofructokinase, which is going to run glycolysis faster. You're going to stimulate the citric acid cycle to run faster by stimulating the rate-limiting enzyme isocitrate dehydrogenase. You're going to stimulate the electron transport chain to run faster by stimulating cytochrome oxidase. So glycolysis is going to run faster, the citric acid cycle is going to run faster, the electron transport chain is going to run faster. Additionally, calcium in the muscle and epinephrine in the bloodstream are going to stimulate more glycogen to be broken down to glucose for glycolysis, which we're running faster, right? We need more glycogen to be broken down to glucose if we want to run glycolysis faster, okay? So we have everything we need now with the greater rate of ADP inside of the muscle cell to cause all of these systems to run at a greater rate, presumably to run them faster to try and meet ATP demand. But let's look at where the problems might come into play. If we run glycolysis faster, we produce more pyruvate, and we also produce more NADH. That pyruvate and NADH, in theory, should be fed into the mitochondria, and then the pyruvate will be fed through the citric acid cycle, which is running even faster, right, to produce more NADH as well as some FADH. So now we're producing more NADH, more FADH. More NADH and more FADH can now be fed into the electron transport chain, which in theory, thanks to ADP, should also be running at a greater rate. So we've got more electrons being shuttled through the system thanks to more NADH and FADH. We've got the electron transport chain running faster. We should be pumping more than hydrogen ions into the inner membrane space. Should be creating a greater gradient, so we should be running more hydrogen ions through ATP synthase, producing more ATP, and maybe meeting the increased demand. But the problem, if there is one, is going to be potentially linked to the amount of oxygen that's available. So what could possibly happen here? I think the easiest thing that we can do is try to just create some fictitious numbers. They're going to be kind of ridiculous, but I think it's helpful in the comprehension of this. So let's pretend that during the 6 mile an hour jog, the ATP demand from the muscle cell was 80 ATP per second. Okay. You already know ADP levels rised. That triggered glycolysis to run faster, the citric acid cycle to run faster, the electron transport chain to run faster. There was enough oxygen coming. So ultimately, we met this ATP demand of 80 ATP per second using oxidative phosphorylation in the electron transport chain. That was able to produce us 80 ATP per second. Right? So we met the demand through oxidative phosphorylation. Now let's talk about what might happen when we go up to, again, our 8-9 mile an hour instance. let's say that it goes from 80 ATP per second at 6 miles per hour to at 9 miles per hour, the demand for ATP is 120 ATP per second. Remember, we're producing 80 ATP per second using oxidative phosphorylation. But now the demand is 120 and we're only resynthesizing 80 ATP per second. So it's going to accumulate ADP, right? You already know, as I went through, that's going to cause glycolysis to run even faster, the citric acid cycle to run faster, oxidative phosphorylation to run faster, because of all of that ADP that's accumulating. By those systems running faster, we're now going to deliver more NADH and FADH to the system, right? And that is going to cause, in theory, this system to run faster. In theory, if we can bring enough oxygen to this system to remove the electrons, then by bringing more NADH and FADH to the system, by running those other systems faster, we should be able to run oxidative phosphorylation fast enough to produce 120 ATP per second. But the problem lies, potentially, with oxygen. What we need is enough oxygen to come to the electron transport chain to keep removing electrons from the fourth complex so that the electrons can be fed through here fast enough to create a great enough and fast enough gradient to keep ATP synthase rotating at a rate to create 120 ATP per second. But what might happen, particularly in certain types of muscle fibers, is that they're limited in the amount of oxygen that can actually come to the muscle fiber. Maybe only so much oxygen can come to the muscle fiber and to the electron transport chain, and that means only so many electrons can be removed from the fourth complex. So there's a maximal amount of oxygen that can actually come to the electron transport chain, and that means only so many electrons can be removed from the fourth complex. That doesn't mean that electrons don't keep being fed through the complexes. They do, because we're producing a whole bunch of extra NADH and FADH, remember, because ADP accumulated, and we're running those systems faster, glycolysis and the citric acid cycle. So we're producing extra NADH and FADH to be fed through the electron transport chain. But now we've reached a maximum amount of oxygen that can come to the muscle cell, and only so many electrons can actually be removed from the fourth complex. So what's going to happen is, since all these extra electrons are coming to the chain, they're going to begin to build up, right? They're going to be backed up like a traffic jam. Right? Because we're feeding these electrons into the electron transport chain, but only so many of them are being removed because we're only bringing so much oxygen to the muscle cell. Just as an example, let's say that only enough oxygen can be brought to the electron transport chain to run it at a rate where it can produce 100 ATP per second. That's the most it can produce, right? The maximal amount of oxygen is being brought to the electron transport chain. It's removing as many electrons as it can, so that it's running the chain as fast as possible. But at that rate, only 100 ATP can be created per second. Enough NADH and FADH is actually being brought to the chain for it to make 120 ATP per second to try and meet the demand of 120 ATP, right? That's the demand. Enough NADH and FADH is being created and brought to the chain, but not enough oxygen is actually coming to remove the electrons. So the electrons are backing up and only 100 ATP is being generated. So now the resynthesis of ATP from oxidative phosphorylation is continuing to rest underneath what the demand of the muscle cell is. So what's now going to start to accumulate even more ADP is accumulating due to the fact that the demand of ATP is not being met by the resynthesis within oxidative phosphorylation because not enough oxygen is actually being brought to it to run it fast enough. And I would mention there's already going to be like a traffic jam of NADH and FADH at the level of the electron transport chain, right? Because these electrons are getting backed up because they're not getting removed by oxygen fast enough from the fourth complex. So you're going to have all of this NADH and FADH coming to a backed up system, right? Because you're producing enough NADH and FADH to feed electrons through the chain for it to actually produce 120. But there's not enough oxygen coming to it for it to actually accomplish that. So you've already got like NADH and FADH accumulating near the electron transport chain, trying to give their electrons to a backed up system. And also now you've got this ADP that's going to continue to accumulate from ATP demand not being met. And remember, the molecules that can accumulate, like ADP, inorganic phosphate, hydrogen ions from ATP demand not being met, can cause fatigue. But, as you're going to see, that's not going to happen just yet. So that accumulation of ADP is going to cause glycolysis to run even faster. Right? We're going to produce even more pyruvate. We're going to produce even more NADH. The citric acid cycle is also going to be running faster, and that pyruvate that's being created is some of it's going to be shuttled into the mitochondria, and we're going to try and run that pyruvate through a citric acid cycle that's running even faster due to that greater accumulation of ADP from the demand of ATP still not being met. So now what are we producing even more of? More NADH and more FADH. If you remember, the electron transport chain is already maxed out, and there's already NADH and FADH waiting to be fed into it. So we're getting this accumulation of NADH and FADH because more NADH and FADH was already being created than what the electron transport chain could process due to a lack of oxygen, insufficient oxygen. Now what are we doing? Creating even more NADH and FADH. So what are you seeing here? There's going to be this big accumulation of NADH and FADH, and it's going to come to the point of this. What do you need to actually run the citric acid cycle? You need NAD, and you also need FAD, which is over here. If you've got all of your NAD and FAD in the form of NADH and FADH waiting to get in the electron transport chain, how are you going to keep running the citric acid cycle? You won't. The citric acid cycle will slow, right? It'll come to a halt because most of your NAD that's needed is going to be in the form of NADH. Look at what you need to convert pyruvate into acetyl-CoA. You have to oxidize pyruvate into acetyl-CoA, and you need NAD in order to accomplish that. So this whole system is backed up. You're going to have that pyruvate being shuttled into the mitochondria, and it's not going to have anywhere to go, right? Because the system is backed up, and eventually pyruvate's going to accumulate inside of the mitochondria, and it's also going to accumulate inside of the cytosol because it loses its gradient to even come into the mitochondria anymore, right? Because now there's a high concentration of pyruvate in the mitochondria trying to go through the citric acid cycle, which is maxed out. Not maxed out, but in a sense it is because it's it's slowed significantly due to a lack of needed NAD. So the pyruvate accumulates in the mitochondria, which is ultimately going to cause less pyruvate to move from the cytosol into the mitochondria. So now we've got this pyruvate, which is going to kind of be backed up in the cytosol. Here's this pyruvate being unable to move into the mitochondria anymore. So what are we getting? We're getting an accumulation of pyruvate. We're also getting an accumulation of NADH, because what's accumulated in the mitochondria is NADH. How are you going to move more more NADH into the mitochondria when there's already a lot of NADH in the mitochondria? You don't have a gradient for it. It's not possible. So now you've got pyruvate and NADH accumulating in the cytosol. They don't have a means to get into the mitochondria. And this all stems from the fact that there's not enough oxygen in the electron transport chain to actually run it fast enough to meet the demand of ATP. All these molecules that are needed to run oxidative phosphorylation fast enough to meet ATP demand are there, but the limiting factor may be oxygen. So this pyruvate and NADH accumulates, and then what happens? Pyruvate gets converted into lactate to regenerate NAD so that it can be fed back into glycolysis to keep what's now referred to as anaerobic glycolysis, which is independent of oxygen, as hopefully you can see now, going. This type of glycolysis is not dependent upon the electron transport chain running fast enough. You can just turn pyruvate into lactate, regenerate NAD, and you can keep this system running, right, at a faster and faster rate. And you can keep producing more ATP from this system than you can from oxidative phosphorylation. That doesn't mean that oxidative phosphorylation slows down at all, right? Oxidative phosphorylation is still producing 100 ATP per second, which is not meeting the demand of ATP, which is 120 ATP per second. Okay? That's what's mainly driving all of this, is that oxidative phosphorylation is not meeting the demand of ATP from the muscle cell due to insufficient amount of oxygen. So that causes a backup of pyruvate and NADH in the cytosol for the reasons that we just discussed. Now the muscle cell is transitioning to using both oxidative phosphorylation and anaerobic or slow glycolysis to meet ATP demand. This anaerobic or fast glycolysis can make up the other 20 ATP molecules that are needed to meet the ATP demand of 120 ATP per second. So now the muscle cell uses both aerobic and anaerobic metabolism together to meet the demand of ATP from the cell. This is one of the ideas as to how the transition occurs between aerobic or slow glycolysis to a combination of aerobic or slow glycolysis and anaerobic or fast glycolysis. It would be because the demand of ATP from the muscle cell ends up exceeding what the aerobic or oxidative phosphorylation system can produce. That, through the mechanisms that I showed you, ends up resulting in the activation and start of anaerobic or fast glycolysis running at a greater rate to work with oxidative phosphorylation or aerobic metabolism to meet ATP demand. So let's step backwards for a second and really try to visualize what it is that I'm saying. Okay, this is one muscle fiber, right? That's the one muscle fiber. What goes by muscle fibers? Well, what goes by muscle fibers are blood vessels, right? And what's carried in the blood vessels? What blood is made up of red blood cells and plasma,
And inside of the red blood cells, there's oxygen. Okay? So the blood within the vessels goes past the muscle fibers. And what happens? The oxygen that's within the red blood cells, oxygen, travels from the red blood cells inside of the blood vessel, then into the muscle fiber. Right? That's one of the main reasons that we take blood past our cells, is so that the oxygen within the red blood cells can leave the red blood cells and go into our cells. So where does that oxygen go once it leaves the blood vessel, right? Well, it goes into the muscle cell and then it goes into the mitochondria. Right? I mean, you probably know this already, but I think it's helpful to really see a visual of this. Okay, so the oxygen is going from the blood into the muscle fiber or the muscle cell, and then it diffuses into the mitochondria. And then how is it used in the mitochondria? Well, it goes to complex 4 and removes the electrons so that the electron transport chain can keep operating, and then the mitochondria can keep producing ATP to meet the ATP demand of, in this case, a muscle fiber or any other cell, whatever it is. All cells need to produce ATP to survive. Now, in my initial example, I said we're like 6 miles an hour, and the muscle fiber is, this particular muscle fiber is involved in running at 6 miles an hour, and you're asking it to contract relatively forcefully. It depends on the type of fiber, but you're asking it to contract relatively forcefully, relatively frequently, right? So it's got a decent ATP demand. I said 80 ATP per second. I mean, in reality, that's going to be in the hundreds of thousands. You know, this is just to simplify it and to give an example. It's not going to be, you know, the cell needs many more than 80 ATP per second, but it's just to make a point, okay? What I'm saying is, at 6 miles an hour, the theory is there's enough blood traveling past the muscle fiber to deliver enough oxygen to the muscle fiber so that the oxygen can go into the mitochondria and remove electrons from the 4th complex fast enough so that these mitochondria can produce 80 ATP per second, and this ATP demand can be met through, in this case, aerobic glycolysis, which is, you know, makes ATP through oxidative phosphorylation. I sometimes say those two things synonymously, which they kind of are, but aren't at the same time, because other systems use oxidative phosphorylation too. But aerobic glycolysis makes ATP through oxidative phosphorylation. The point is, enough oxygen is coming to this muscle fiber to allow it to make enough ATP through aerobic glycolysis, aerobic metabolism, oxidative phosphorylation, whatever, to meet its ATP demand. All is good. You would not expect any lactate really to be accumulating inside of this fiber. Now I said, you know, you go up to 9 miles an hour. I think that might have been a little steep. Why don't we do like 7.5? That might make a little bit more sense. Either way, right? You increase the intensity of exercise and the ATP demand rises. No matter what intensity we go up, I think it's easier to go up in little smaller increments, but let's say 7.5 miles an hour, ATP demand rises to, what did I say, 120 ATP per second. And we're going to again say that this is, rather than 9 miles an hour, let's say this is 7 miles per hour. You've gone from 6 to 7.5 miles an hour. What are you asking the muscle fiber to do? You're asking it to, well, contract more frequently and more forcefully. We'll talk about all that later on when we get to skeletal muscle, but I think you could see how ATP demand is going to rise inside of the fiber. Well, if ATP demand is 120, and we're only producing 80 ATP per second, the demand is 120 ATP per second, and we're supplying 80 ATP per second, you're going to get a big accumulation initially of ADP, inorganic phosphate, hydrogen ions, you know, more epinephrine is going to increase in the bloodstream because exercise intensity is rising, more calcium is in the fiber because it's contracting more frequently and forcefully. All those things are going to accelerate the rate of glycolysis. More glycogen is going to be broken down to glucose because of epinephrine and calcium. Glycolysis is going to run faster thanks to ADP, allosterically activating phosphofructokinase. So inside of the muscle fiber, in the cytosol, the intracellular fluid, you're going to get a lot more pyruvate and NADH. You need a lot more pyruvate, you need a lot more NADH. And that pyruvate and that NADH, we'll say at first, the majority of it enters into the mitochondria. The NADH enters in order to go to the electron transport chain, and pyruvate enters in order to be converted into acetyl-CoA and then be shuttled around the Krebs cycle to make a whole bunch more NADH. And that's all fuel. All that NADH that's being created from pyruvate by turning it into acetyl-CoA and running it through the Krebs cycle in the mitochondria is to create more NADH from it, which is fuel for the electron transport chain in order to make more ATP. So in theory, we can get the mitochondria to be producing 120 ATP per second in order to meet this demand. Now here's where the oxygen theory comes into play. Okay? Like I said, there are other theories that revolve around this, but I'm giving you the oxygen theory in this class. If you're interested in the more in other ones, by all means take more advanced courses. The idea with the oxygen theory is the problem is not that, it's not related to the production of fuel for the electron transport chain. Okay? You can produce plenty of NADH, right, from glycolysis and from turning pyruvate into acetyl-CoA and running it through the Krebs cycle. Like, you can produce tons of NADH and FADH for the electron transport chain. The theoretical basis for the oxygen theory is there comes a point where there's not enough oxygen being delivered from the blood to the muscle fiber. So there's insufficient oxygen to remove all of those electrons within the electron transport chain. There's enough fuel in the form of NADH and FADH for the electron transport chain, but there comes an intensity, whether that's because the blood vessels become occluded or because there isn't enough blood vessels leading to particular muscle fiber types, whatever the case might be, there's many possibilities in this theory. There comes a point where there's like just an insufficient quantity of oxygen being delivered to the mitochondria per the amount of NADH that's being created for the electron transport chain. So maybe we can get enough oxygen into the mitochondria so that it will produce 100 ATP per second, but that's kind of the electron transport chain's maximal rate. And it's maxed out because we're bringing as much oxygen as we can to the muscle fiber, and no more oxygen can come to this fiber. So 100 ATP per second through aerobic glycolysis, meaning the production of ATP through oxidative phosphorylation, 100 ATP per second is the most that the fiber can do. So again, I know I'm repeating myself of what I just went through, but I think it's helpful, in my opinion, to actually visualize this and see the muscle fiber, and not just look at these, different intermediates, images and molecular structures, like to see this and actually think about what's going on, okay? So through aerobic glycolysis, we're creating 100 ATP per second. The ATP demand is 120. So the supply of ATP is not meeting the demand. Okay? So what's really going to start accumulating even more to greater and greater degrees? ADP, right? ADP is going to accumulate even more because the demand for ATP is higher than the supply. And what ADP is going to do is it's going to trigger glycolysis to run even faster, right? And then you're going to start producing even more pyruvate. You're going to start producing even more NADH in glycolysis, okay? And you can imagine trying to feed that pyruvate and NADH into the mitochondria. You're producing all this NADH from glycolysis and from pyruvate, turning it into acetyl-CoA, running it through the Krebs cycle. You're producing all this NADH that actually can't be run. Let's change the color here, make it red, right? It can't be run through the electron transport chain. So you're producing these large quantities of NADH and FADH that actually can't be run through the electron transport chain. You're producing much more NADH and FADH than what the electron transport chain can actually process. And it comes back in this theory to a lack of oxygen. You need that oxygen to be removing the electrons from the fourth complex in order to keep the electron transport chain running at sufficient speeds, and it's just maxed out. The electron transport chain is maxed out at the rate it can go, but yet you're producing more fuel for it. So you just end up with a traffic jam of electrons, and you also end up with a traffic jam of NADH inside of the mitochondria. All that NADH is waiting to get into the electron transport chain, but it can't, right? You just end up with more and more and more and more NADH in the mitochondria because it can't be fed into the electron transport chain, because it can't run at the rate at which it's being produced. It can't process all this NADH. Okay, so how is that relevant? Well, just think about it. If you have all that NADH in the mitochondria, then go back to the last example, you need NAD in the mitochondria in order to be able to run the Krebs cycle, in order to be able to turn pyruvate into acetyl-CoA. So what you'll ultimately get is an accumulation of both pyruvate and NADH. Both of these will be accumulated in the mitochondria. Why is NADH accumulated in the mitochondria? For obvious reasons, right? It can't, the amount that you're producing can't get into the electron transport chain. And why does pyruvate accumulate? Well, it accumulates because you can't actually turn the pyruvate into acetyl-CoA because all the NAD that's in the mitochondria has been turned into NADH, waiting to get into the electron transport chain. So you're not totally depleted of NAD, but you have a lack of NAD. So you can't actually turn the pyruvate into acetyl-CoA. And that means two things. When pyruvate and NADH both accumulate in the mitochondria, that means the pyruvate and the NADH that's being created in the cytosol from glycolysis in the intracellular fluid does not have a gradient to enter into the mitochondria. We go back to this image right here. Pretend out here is the cytosol, okay? And this is where glycolysis happens. So you're producing pyruvate and NADH through glycolysis in the cytosol. But you've got now all of this pyruvate and all of this NADH that is accumulated in the mitochondria. In here is the mitochondria, the matrix. That's where, the Krebs cycle and the conversion of pyruvate to acetyl-CoA occurs. Okay? So you can't turn the pyruvate into acetyl-CoA because you lack NAD, because it's all NADH, and you've got a whole bunch of NADH accumulated in here waiting to get into the electron transport chain. So this pyruvate and NADH that you're creating in the cytosol doesn't have a gradient to actually get into the mitochondria. So pyruvate and NADH, here's the important part, they begin to accumulate in the cytosol, in the intracellular fluid, because they can't actually get into the mitochondria, so they accumulate in the cytosol, in the intracellular fluid. And here's the part I didn't mention earlier. We think that pyruvate and NADH, when they accumulate in the oxygen theory, again, there are other theories related to this, but in this oxygen theory, we believe that pyruvate and NADH, when they accumulate in the cytosol because they can't get into the mitochondria, we believe that they allosterically activate the enzyme lactate dehydrogenase. The accumulation of these two molecules in the cytosol where lactate dehydrogenase, the enzyme, exists, these two molecules actually stimulate lactate dehydrogenase to become active. And what lactate dehydrogenase does is it takes pyruvate and it reduces pyruvate to lactate, and it oxidizes NADH back to NAD. And you might have like a logical question of, beyond just it can recycle back into the glycolysis, why do you actually need to do this? And the answer is actually the same as the Krebs cycle. Let's first acknowledge that NADH and pyruvate are not getting into the mitochondria. There's an accumulation of NADH and pyruvate in the mitochondria for the reasons that we just discussed. They're not getting into the mitochondria. There's no gradient for them to go in. So they allosterically activate lactate dehydrogenase, and that starts reducing pyruvate to lactate and oxidizing NADH back to NAD. Okay, Why? Think about what would happen if you didn't. Okay? Pyruvate might not be a problem, but what would happen if you just let all this NADH accumulate in the cytosol? It's the same thing as the Krebs cycle. If you let this NADH accumulate in the cytosol, you don't then have any NAD to run glycolysis anymore. If NADH is all just accumulating in the cytosol because it can't ultimately get into the mitochondria, I know I told you the shuttle pathway to get it in there is a little bit more complex than just shuttling it in. But I can promise you, if NADH accumulates in the cytosol, then you lack the NAD that's necessary to actually run glycolysis. So what the cell needs to do is it needs to take this NADH that's accumulating in the cytosol, not turning back into NAD like it normally would. It needs to take that NADH and oxidize it back to NAD and reduce, by doing that, that reduces pyruvate to lactate. And now you've regenerated NAD so that the levels stay sufficiently high in the cytosol to keep glycolysis running at a really rapid pace, completely independent of the oxygen aerobic pathway. This bypasses aerobic glycolysis or oxidative phosphorylation. You don't need oxygen in this pathway. So even though there's insufficient amounts of oxygen coming to the muscle fiber, and that's clogging up, all of oxidative phosphorylation. So oxidative phosphorylation can only make 100 ATP per second. You would think there's nothing else that you can do, like you're just stuck and the ATP demand is forever higher than the supply. Not true. This system bypasses any need for oxygen within the mitochondria. Nowhere here do you see oxygen being required. So this system can make ATP completely independent of oxygen and help meet the ATP demand. So this system right now is going to run and it's going to produce the additional 20 ATP that are necessary to meet ATP demand. So you're going to make 100 ATP through aerobic glycolysis that uses oxidative phosphorylation to make ATP, and you're going to make 20 ATP through anaerobic, in this case with the oxygen theory, anaerobic, also called fast glycolysis, to make up the other 20 ATP. And these two systems together will meet the ATP demand of 120. So what are you going to start to see what this fiber do? This fiber is going to start producing lactate. And it was historically believed that that production of lactate was actually causing the muscle fiber to fatigue. They thought it was lactic acid. And we now know really that couldn't be any further from the truth. The more lactate you can produce, the more anaerobic glycolysis, if it is in fact the oxygen theory being accurate, that would be the correct term, because if this pathway is independent of oxygen, anaerobic glycolysis, the more lactate you can produce, the more anaerobic glycolysis you can run, the more ATP you can make through it, and the better the ATP demand you can meet, right? So in theory, the better you can run anaerobic glycolysis, in theory, the less the muscle fiber should fatigue in different circumstances. Anyways, I hope those visuals were helpful, and now let's continue on with greater intensities. So where are we at? We're at 7.5 miles an hour on the treadmill. ATP demand inside of this one muscle fiber is 120 ATP per second. 100 ATP are being made through oxidative phosphorylation, aerobic glycolysis, which is what uses oxidative phosphorylation. 20 ATP are being made through anaerobic glycolysis. The two of them together are meeting this demand of 120 ATP. Now let's say that we go up to, got a little ahead of myself earlier on in the lecture, but let's say that we go now up to 9 miles per hour. Okay. Let's say ATP demand at 9 miles an hour rises to like 200, right? Really kicks up. That's a high intensity. Disproportionate compared to the other increases. Now the ATP demand from the muscle fiber is 200, right? The muscle fiber is contracting more forcefully, it's contracting more frequently, and the ATP demand is 200 ATP per second. What are you producing? 120 right now. Okay, so the ATP demand from the fiber is way higher than the supply. What's going to accumulate? ADP, inorganic phosphate, all that stuff. Epinephrine is going to rise in the blood, more calcium in the fiber. What does all of this mean? You're going to break more glycogen down to glucose 6-phosphate. More ADP is going to allosterically activate phosphofructokinase. You're going to run glycolysis faster. You're going to start producing even more pyruvate. You're going to start producing even more NADH. And you can just ask yourself, do you think any of that pyruvate or NADH that you're creating is going to move into the mitochondria? Not any more than it was in the last example, right? All of this extra NADH and pyruvate that you're creating here is not going to be able to enter into the mitochondria. Remember, pyruvate and NADH in theory are already accumulated in the mitochondria. You're certainly not going to be able to bring more oxygen now to the fiber when you already weren't in the last example. Okay, so the muscle fiber is already receiving as much oxygen as it can, running oxidative phosphorylation as fast as possible. It maxed out in the last example. So as we increase the intensity even further in this example to a greater degree, we're going to start running glycolysis even faster than the last example. Everything that's there to run glycolysis faster, everything that's needed to run glycolysis faster is here, right? More ADP is accumulating. There's more epinephrine in the bloodstream. There's more calcium in the fiber. Everything that we need to run glycolysis faster is here. We're going to run glycolysis faster. But really, none of the extra pyruvate and NADH that's created is going to go into the mitochondria. What's going to happen? It's all going to accumulate out in the cytosol, and it's going to stimulate lactate dehydrogenase to an even greater degree. It's going to allosterically activate lactate dehydrogenase, bind to it, activate it, stimulate it. And you're going to start converting even more pyruvate into lactate and even more NADH back to NAD. And that's going to help you run this system faster and faster and faster and faster and faster. All of the NADH and lactate that's being created is going to get turned into lactate and back to NAD. And that's going to allow anaerobic glycolysis, again, this pathway is independent of oxygen, to just run faster. And let's say that it actually can run fast enough, right? It can produce 100 ATP with oxidative phosphorylation, and now it's producing 200 ATP per second, right? And that's actually meeting the ATP demand. This fiber is producing a ton of lactate, but it's actually meeting the ATP demand. So in theory, this fiber should not actually fatigue at 9 miles per hour. And there's plenty of people that can run at 9 miles per hour and not fatigue. They need to be pretty good endurance runners, but it's by no means out of the realm of possibility. There are people that can do this. Now, interestingly, for reasons that we'll talk about later on in the semester when we get to lactate threshold, this lactate that's being produced, probably at this intensity, wouldn't really show up very much in the bloodstream because it's being cleared by other parts of your body, like the liver and other muscle cells. But you can be certain this muscle fiber is producing, pretty decent quantities of lactate at this point. It's using a good combination of both aerobic and anaerobic glycolysis together to meet this ATP demand. So now let's actually get to the point of fatigue. All this should look familiar. At 9 miles per hour, the ATP demand was 200 ATP per second. Through oxidative phosphorylation, aerobic glycolysis, and anaerobic glycolysis, we are meeting the ATP demand of 200. But now we go up to 11 miles per hour. At 11 miles per hour, let's say the ATP demand rises to 300 ATP per second. Right? It's going to be, in reality, millions of ATP that are needed inside of a real muscle fiber, but again, simplicity I think is helpful. So 300 ATP per second. What's that mean? ATP demand is higher than supply, so what's going to accumulate? Lots of ADP. Now we can say that epinephrine is going to rise in the bloodstream, calcium rise in the fiber probably to a greater degree, so more glycogen is going to be broken down into glucose. We're going to stimulate phosphofructokinase to a greater degree. Glycolysis is going to start running faster. We're going to produce more pyruvate and NADH. Certainly that extra pyruvate and NADH that are being created here are not going to get shuttled into the mitochondria. Pyruvate is going to get turned into lactate, NADH back to NAD, and we're going to run glycolysis faster, anaerobic glycolysis faster. Now, the thing that in my example here, we finally reached the point where fatigue is going to happen because, the phosphagen system may be able to assist for a short period of time here to keep things going to meet ATP demand, but the phosphagen system, as you know, doesn't last long, and it would have been utilized at different components, some of it as you were exercising anyways. So it's really not going to assist us much here for any meaningful amount of time, if at all. The point I'm trying to make here is maybe we can get anaerobic glycolysis to produce us 180 ATP per second. I don't know, I'm just making up a number. Oxidative phosphorylation is producing 100, anaerobic glycolysis is producing 180, so collectively that's 280 ATP per second. But anaerobic glycolysis can't actually run fast enough, whether that's due to the Vmax of the enzymes or other factors. That's certainly up for debate, but there comes a point where anaerobic glycolysis just simply cannot run fast enough to help meet the ATP demand of the muscle fiber. Anaerobic glycolysis is producing 180, oxidative phosphorylation is producing 100, that's 280 total, but the demand is 300, and the system can't run any faster. So now ATP demand is sustained at a higher level than supply. And what will accumulate indefinitely at that point? ADP, inorganic phosphate, hydrogen ions, right? These molecules from ATP hydrolysis that are not being turned back into ATP. ATP demand is sustained at a higher level than supply. And thus, the products of ATP hydrolysis will just rise exponentially. And we believe then that is what causes the muscle fiber to fatigue, as we'll talk about later on in the class, and certainly in other advanced courses we go into much more detail about it. Why would we want the muscle fiber to fatigue here? We think that fatigue, again, I said this before, but we think that fatigue happens when the ATP demand in a fiber is sustained at higher levels than the supply. And that prevents the muscle fiber from becoming completely depleted of ATP and thus dying. Hopefully what's clear to you from looking at this is you need ATP in order to make ATP. So if you completely deplete a muscle fiber of ATP, it actually loses its capacity to make ATP. Without ATP, you don't have life. So this is really where fatigue has gone in the last decade or so. It's believed to be a form of really self-preservation of cells, right? Muscle cells. Muscle cells really don't regenerate, so if they die, they don't really come back, at least to any meaningful degree. So that's where this comes from, right? You finally reached an intensity of exercise. This varies depending upon how trained you are and all sorts of other components of exercise performance, but you reach a point where the demand of ATP within the fiber is higher than the supply. And then the products of the breakdown of ATP accumulate exponentially with no reversal. And that causes the muscle fiber to fatigue so that ATP demand drops. Because if you cause a muscle fiber to fatigue, its ATP demand will drop. And then you can get back to where the ATP demand is actually being met by the supply. And that's the idea of fatigue. This is one of the last times I'm going to talk about this in any meaningful detail, but what I've presented to you is the oxygen theory. It has been the theoretical basis for what drives the transition from only aerobic glycolysis to a combination of aerobic and anaerobic glycolysis for 100+ years. Okay? People that study this, a huge segment of the population to this day still believes that the oxygen theory, what I've gone through with you, is true. That basically muscle fibers, we're going to talk about this shortly, but certainly particular muscle fibers, faster twitch fibers, they have poor blood supply, they have lack of mitochondria inside, and they have very high ATP demands. The opposite is true for slower twitch fibers. And that translates into the fibers, again, especially the faster twitch fibers, reaching points where their ATP demands are higher than what they can produce through the utilization of oxygen via oxidative phosphorylation. Basically, their ATP demand can rise above what they're able to create through oxidative phosphorylation. And then that causes a transition over inside of the fiber to anaerobic glycolysis, a pathway that produces ATP independent of oxygen. This is the thing that this is one of the last times. There is another emerging theory, it's a collection of theories that suggests, and much of it is educated and well-founded, that oxygen may have very little to do or nothing to do with what is causing anaerobic glycolysis and what's causing anaerobic glycolysis to be occurring. It might not be oxygen, basically, that drives muscle fibers to utilize anaerobic glycolysis, and that's where the term fast glycolysis has started to come from. I mentioned it earlier, but now that you've seen the whole mechanism, maybe when you hear that, it can make a little bit more sense. I know I'm not going to go through the whole pathway, it'd be very time consuming, but basically the scientists believe that anaerobic glycolysis is used by muscle fibers, and it really doesn't have to do with oxidative phosphorylation, aerobic metabolism being maxed out. It's something else that's driving it. And if that's the case, you couldn't call it anaerobic glycolysis. It exists, but the terminology, they believe, is inaccurate. All right, I'm just mentioning that to you so that you know it. And if you're curious, you can learn more about it. I'm going to continue to teach the rest of this class as if this oxygen theory is a fact. I'm going to use it to teach lactate threshold and the oxygen deficit period and all this stuff that is the big concepts in exercise physiology. But at the same time, I want you to be aware that there are opinions and good scientific opinions that counter this. And the absolute last thing I want to say in this lecture, which I know has been long, is that this is kind of the first time I'm really going to mention this at all, not in any meaningful detail, but inside of a whole muscle, there are all sorts of different muscle fiber types. There are different types of slow twitch muscle fibers, there are different types of fast twitch muscle fibers, and I want to say that they all use these systems theoretically in the same way. Like they theoretically use aerobic glycolysis in the same way, and they would theoretically transition to anaerobic glycolysis in the same way if they were to become maxed out in terms of the amount of oxygen that they can receive, and they would theoretically use the phosphagen system in the same way. Now, with that said, the degrees to which different muscle fiber types rely on these systems is vastly different depending upon whether you're talking about a really slow twitch muscle fiber or a really fast twitch muscle fiber. They have different ATP demands depending upon the type of myosin heads that they have and number of myofibrils and actinomyosin inside. And thus, with different ATP demands, different muscle fiber types will rely on different degrees of, say, aerobic metabolism versus aerobic and anaerobic metabolism. You can probably imagine a muscle fiber with very high ATP demands, like fast twitch fibers, rely much more heavily on anaerobic glycolysis, which can produce ATP very, very quickly independent of oxygen, than a slower twitch muscle fiber that has a much lower ATP demand. Slower twitch muscle fibers, for example, especially the slowest muscle fiber types, really might never, use any meaningful amount of anaerobic glycolysis at all, ever. And it all comes back to, what's their ATP demand and the amount of oxygen that they can receive and the number of mitochondria that they have inside. The theoretical pathway that they all use is the same. But what I'm saying is the degrees to which they use these systems will vary depending upon their specific characteristics. And that's really what's coming up in the future with this class.